This is your concept outline review for periods 7 and periods 8 of the new APUS framework. So in period 7, we're going to go over a number of different things on the domestic front and some things on the foreign policy front as well, leading from 1900 up until right after World War II. So the first major one is progressivism. In progressivism, like what I want the students to get out of this is to see that this really is this watershed moment in which so many different major reform movements finally coalesce together, and they do a dramatic change in the way that U.S. citizens see the role of government to states and to the citizens. One of the major causes that I want to bring up for the students are the muckrakers. These were the different newspaper and magazine writers who developed a social consciousness movement about problems and poverty and monopolies within society. Some of the big examples I want the students to know about are Ida Tarbell, who criticized John Rockefeller for his unfair monopolization practices within oil, Jacob Riis, who criticized the growing disparity between rich and poor immigrants, Lincoln Steffens, who criticized the corruption of municipal governments, Ray Stannard Baker, who talked about racism in the northern cities, and Upton Sinclair, who talked about the poor practices of labor and production of goods. Now, what this eventually did was it changed the president of the time, who actually criticized these writers and gave them their name of muckrakers, because he saw them always raking in the mud or the negative parts of U.S. history. President Theodore Roosevelt established an approach to both restrict monopolizations and protect workers. And I want the students to have some specific examples about this. Now, there are a lot of examples they can choose from, but the three big ones I like to choose from because I think they're so emblematic of the time period are the anthracite coal strike, where for the first time federal government negotiated on the side of unions, the Meat Inspection Act, in which there were regulations on the meat industry, and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which provided for regulations on food and drugs from industries. Now, what I'd like to tell the students out of those examples is that Teddy Roosevelt had a very specific mindset. His mindset was that monopolies were either good or they were bad. They were good if monopolies provided a good competitive practice and a good competitive product. They were bad if monopolies had rigged the market in favor of themselves. Now, the reason why this becomes important is that this allows us to make a synthesis back to Alexander Hamilton. Conservation and preservation. One of the big new elements of the new framework is to talk about the relationship of the environment to the government and to the citizen. This is a precursor to our current environmentalist movement. However, there are some differences. So I want to point out to the students that one of the movements at the time is conservation, a more efficient utilization of resources. On the other side is preservation, a respect for nature for its own inherent beauty. So what I like to do is make a connection here, and again, this provides a great synthesis moment in order to connect up to the movement of environmentalism. However, what I want to point out to them is that even within environmentalism, we see a lot of these precursors. Environmentalism, in many ways, in the 1960s started to resort towards preservation, and it did this under the book of Rachel Carson, who developed the notion of ecology, or all things being connected within the environment. Now, ecology was not an idea back during the days of preservation, but preservation establishes the roots or the framework for what we're eventually going to see in the environmentalist movement. The example of this I want to bring up is the Hetch Hetchy Valley. Here, John Muir argued the case for preserving nature for its inherent beauty. On the opposite side, the Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger, wanted to develop a part of the valley up in the Yosemite region. Eventually, Gifford Pinchot argued for a moderate ground of making it a part of the national parks. Woodrow Wilson. So on the opposite side of Teddy Roosevelt is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, being a Democrat, wins the election in 1912 by a plurality in which he split the Republican vote between Theodore Roosevelt and Howard Taft. Woodrow Wilson was then able to win in that election. Woodrow Wilson supported something called the New Freedom, in which he wanted to break down all big elements of society. This is where I like to make a synthesis to Jefferson's yeoman farmer. And what I explain to the students is this is what we call transvaluation. Here's what I mean by that. Wilson did not believe in small farmers. He wasn't trying to harken back to Jefferson's yeoman farmer idea, but he did believe in small businesses. In many ways, this does harken back to Jefferson's idea of a yeoman farmer, just transvalued or changed in value to a new type of institution. So here we see, on the one hand, Teddy Roosevelt and Alexander Hamilton, Wilson, and Jefferson. Some of Wilson's policies I want to bring up: the Clayton Antitrust Act, which created regulations to make the Sherman Antitrust Act actually work, the Underwood Tariff Act, which lowered tariff rates to create more competition, and the Federal Reserve Act, which was intended to break down monopolies in the private banking system. The Roaring Twenties. Now, in the Roaring Twenties, new technologies drove the American economy, as well as the post-war economic problems for Great Britain. The stock market at that time period was growing largely due to marginal payments, meaning people would put down a minor amount of money and then borrow the rest. So typically they would put down like 10%, they would borrow the other 90%. The Federal Reserve eventually in the late 1920s feared what was happening. They saw the rising possibility of speculation, and they raised interest rates in order to slow down the growth and protect the American gold reserves. If things got out of hand, it was very likely that people were going to exchange their money for gold, buy that gold, and take that elsewhere. The stock market then collapsed, leading to a loss of real investments. And the Federal Reserve feared that if they pumped too much money into the economy, they would devalue the American currency. And then, because of that, they did not fulfill their job as the lender of last resort. Now, what's really interesting about this is that there is a great connection you can make, a great synthesis to today's 2008 crisis. The chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time was Ben Bernanke, and Ben Bernanke is known to have studied what happened during the Great Depression. He knows that this was the point when the Federal Reserve lost its nerve, did not pump out money into the economy. This time around, 2008, Ben Bernanke had promised that he would never let this happen again, and when 2008 occurred, he ended up pumping into the economy $4 trillion in order to try to keep it afloat. So this is an excellent way that you could provide a synthesis to today's economic problems. Now, back during the Great Depression, there was a closing of the banks, and that led to a loss of economic growth and a 25% unemployment rate. FDR and the New Deal. So FDR comes into office in 1932, and he establishes the first New Deal, which was intended to balance the federal budget, boost consumer spending, and solve overproduction. So he did this through a number of different policies, and this is one of the hard parts, I think, in teaching students. There are so many policies you can point to, but I like to use emblematic policies. So, for example, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the hiring of young men for public works for consumerism, the bank holiday in Glass-Steagall, an attempt to get confidence back in the banks and to break up the banks to make sure that they wouldn't do over-speculation again. And the National Recovery Act, which set voluntary limits to production and prices in order to solve overproduction. Within this, in 1937, Roosevelt's advisors, his more conservative advisors, told him the economy was starting to get back on track, and so they told him he should cut back on spending. In 1937, he did this, and it led to a massive contraction, or what's called the Roosevelt recession. So the second New Deal used Keynesian economics, or deficit spending, in order to get consumer spending going. Roosevelt turned from believing in a balanced budget and started to spend in a deficit budget in order to try and get the economy going by pumping money into the economy. Unemployment did fall during this time period, all the way up until 1941. It fell from 25% to 10% if we include both private and public sector hiring. However, it did not go below 10%. We would not see that happen until the spending that was done during World War II. So some political realignments during this time. During the Great Depression, workers split. What ended up happening was we had the AFL. The AFL broke apart. John Lewis established the Congress of Industrial Organization, and they would use a much more militant way, or what were known as wildcat strikes, to force wages to go up. So what was a wildcat strike? They would actually sit down inside of factories, forcing the stop of production and not allowing new workers to come in order to take their place. African Americans also began to move in larger numbers in a political realignment for the first time over to the Democratic Party. And this is where we're going to start to see a beginning of the shift that's going to take place, although it's going to take place for a while. For African Americans, I always tell people in my class, African Americans always saw themselves as faithful and loyal members of the Republican Party because Abraham Lincoln had set them free from slavery. The point when that starts to change is in 1936, although the massive change is not going to take place until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. FDR's coalition then ended up including farmers, urban unions, and urban African Americans. And it's important for the students to see that because this is really going to establish from here on out what we're going to see with the new two-party system that will take place after World War II. So, global conflicts. The American foreign policy during the time period of the 1930s was based upon a neutral stance. Basically, Franklin Roosevelt believed we did not want to get involved like we had during World War I, so instead we would start to open up trade with relationships. FDR pursued this by opening up markets through reciprocal trade agreements with Latin America, so lowering the tariffs in Latin America, trying to create sort of free trade zones. Also, he established the Good Neighbor policy, which was meant to respect national sovereignty and get us away from the policies of his cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, that had taken place in which we had taken over the sovereignty of places like the Philippines. The Washington Naval Conference made a pledge to promise for de-escalating tensions by developing less naval battleships. However, what this really ended up doing was it allowed for Adolf Hitler to simply build his military while we de-escalated ours. In fact, Hitler developed a fascist model in which the government spent so much money on the German military that they were able to lower unemployment to below 2%. In fact, the total amount of people not being hired at the time within Germany was about 600,000, whereas within America it was anywhere from 10% to 25%. Japanese expansion. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry from the United States had opened up Tokugawa, Japan for trade to the West. The Japanese, in response to this, decided to establish what's called the Meiji Restoration, in which they created a strong industrial economy in Japan and then began expanding outwards. Japan would win major areas through this expansion. For example, in the late 1800s, they beat China during the Sino-Japanese War, and then Japan defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. But it was really the Great Depression, once again, that changed Japan for what we were going to see during World War II. Up until this time, Japan was nationalist, it was industrial, and it saw itself as a leader within the Southeast Asian area. But it was really during the Great Depression when the Japanese export market failed because at that point Americans were not buying Japanese goods. And so at that point, the Japanese leadership turned towards a hyper-nationalist government and wanted to expand out into China. America and Britain then feared the closing of the open door policy that had been established in the late 1800s, and they began negotiating with Japan. Now, what's really important for me, for the students to understand, is the demographic changes that took place during World War II. There was a need for labor in urban centers, and so African Americans and women began moving into these areas. This would create a base for the future civil rights movements and gender movements after World War II. Also, there was a change in immigration. Due to a lack of farmers, the American government established what was called the Bracero program, which incentivized Mexican labor to come for harvesting. During World War II, then, we see this time period as a watershed moment in U.S. history, in which industrialization, the development of national market, and these movements of different demographic groups are going to create in urban centers these large groups of people from different ethnic and gender movements that can eventually form a civil rights movement after World War II. So, how did the Allies eventually end the war? So, the two big strategies were, one, the North African strategy, in which the US and Europe would remove Germany's allies and then invade from Normandy and Russia. Southeast Asia was going to be defeated secondly, and that was going to be defeated through island hopping, in which the idea behind this, developed by Douglas MacArthur, was to attack all the satellites of Japan and isolate it so that it would not have enough resources to keep fighting. Eventually we get to the end of World War II, and when we get there, the big debate that I want the students to have is the atomic bomb debate. And this debate really has not been resolved within historical circles, although it has quieted down over the years. But the two sides of the debate are basically, one, Truman's claim that the atomic bombs were necessary to defeat the Japanese because of their extreme nationalism and Bushido Code. Under this belief, until the Japanese emperor said that the war was over, the Japanese would not give up. And so because of that, it did not matter how defeated the Japanese were, they would keep fighting, and this would lead to a massive loss of life. Truman said if we had to invade Japan, 1 million Americans would die. You can imagine how many Japanese would die as well. The critics have argued, though, that we actually did have another possibility. So one of the big arguments is, should we have invaded or should we have used the atomic bomb? If that's the debate, I think most people would have settled on the idea that the atomic bomb becomes somewhat necessary and actually would have saved lives in the long run because we wouldn't have invaded the island. The critics argue that there's a middle position, that actually what we could have offered, and what we eventually did, was to offer the Japanese a conditional surrender, in which the Japanese emperor remained on the throne, but symbolically. And if that were to happen, then at that point, the war could come to an end because the emperor and most of the Japanese leaders wanted that to happen. So then why did we use the atomic bombs, according to the critics? Because we were using them for atomic diplomacy. We were attempting to scare the Russians who were about to invade into the area, and we feared that this would create what had happened at Yalta, that we would end up splitting up Asia between Russia and the United States. And this brings us up to period 8. So in period 8, we have the Cold War. Cold War ends with these suspicions raised between the U.S. and the USSR, like with the atomic bomb debate. So the U.S. ends up adopting George Kennan's strategy of containment. And underneath this containment strategy, there's a number of different policies that come out. George Kennan basically argued that Russia could be contained through military encirclement. But around that, Kennan's policy was followed up by the Marshall Plan, funding for rebuilding of Western Europe, the Truman Doctrine, the funding of anti-communists in areas like Turkey and Greece, NATO, which was a defensive alliance of Northern European and U.S. countries against a possible Russian invasion, and NSC 68, the American buildup of the military to deter the Russians. After this happened, there was a rise of tensions between the two countries, and in the Berlin blockade, Stalin cut off East Berlin from Western Germany. China then falls to communism in 1946, and so now almost one-third of the Earth's population was underneath communism. The Soviets then tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, which shocked all the American policymakers. They believed Soviets would eventually get an atomic bomb, just not so early. And so it was found out the reason why they did was because there were atomic spies found in the U.S. in 1949. And then, on top of all of this, in 1949, North Korea invades South Korea. Red Scare and the rise of Eisenhower Republicans. The Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy in 1949 used the fears of the Korean War in order to attack supposed internal communists. In fact, in 1949, he was coming up for re-election, and Senator Joseph McCarthy went out to dinner one night with some Republican strategists, and they were throwing around different ways that he might get re-elected, and eventually he came upon this idea of attacking people internally to call them communists. Eisenhower eventually was one of the targets, but Eisenhower would attack McCarthy and say this was a wrong direction for Republicans to go in. But Eisenhower did pursue a different policy, though, than containment. He criticized Truman, called for the New Look, or rollback, in which the United States would get rid of the allies of the Soviet Union and eventually invade and liberate people from Soviet communism. But eventually Eisenhower had to back off from this decision, and the best example of this was the Hungarian crisis, in which, under Khrushchev, Hungary tried to break away, and when the Soviet tanks came in, the Hungarian rebellions called out for help. Eisenhower decided not to offer help because of his fear that we could end up in World War III. So he basically settled back on containment. Now, Eisenhower did at the time, though, try to work with Khrushchev to lower tensions and lower the build-up of nuclear arms. And this leads us, of course, to the big conflict of Vietnam. So Eisenhower used the CIA during the 1950s to try to overthrow supposed allies of communism. He also funded anti-communists, especially in Southeast Asia. Kennedy would continue with this, but with military advisors. And our main leader that we supported was a man named Nose Diem, a U.S.-placed leader who ended up being highly corrupt. In fact, when he came in, it appeared that he was going to try to redistribute land in order to get competition going amongst the farmers. He just redistributed land to his friends. Then he tried to force Catholicism on South Vietnam by closing down Buddhist temples. And that led to that very famous scene where a Buddhist sacrifices himself by having somebody light him on fire in a protest in South Vietnam. Eventually, the South Vietnamese military leadership itself replaced Ngo Diem. Lyndon Johnson then upped the commitment after the Gulf of Tonkin incident to 500,000 troops. Civil rights movement. So, World War II, like we had talked about, provided a strong base to the African American civil rights movement as black people were moving into urban centers from the South. Martin Luther King Jr. was picked as the leader of the Montgomery bus boycotts. And then the Supreme Court put a national stamp or seal of approval on these integration efforts for the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Now you notice, this is the key role of the Supreme Court over and over again, is that a movement begins and then the Supreme Court will put a national seal which gives it legitimacy. We saw that in Plessy versus Ferguson on the opposite side, giving legitimacy to Jim Crow laws. Now we see it with the Brown versus Board of Education case on the side of civil rights. There actually were two Brown versus Board of Education cases. The first one said that all schools should be integrated. The second one year later, said it should be done with all due speed. Now, why was that used? Earl Warren, the head of the court, wanted all the members of the court to unanimously agree to this decision. So in order to do that, he gave this vague language of all due speed. It actually took 10 years for the federal government to start giving financial incentives so that schools would actually desegregate. King eventually won momentum in 1963 with the March on Washington, and that led to the Civil Rights Bill of 1963 and the Voting Rights Act of 1964. The Great Society. Now, along with these major acts of civil rights taking place, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson would win a massive election against Barry Goldwater in a huge landslide. And that allowed him, he thought, to establish a mandate to not only pursue civil rights, but to pursue an anti-poverty program as well, which was similar to the New Deal, but slightly different. The New Deal was really about consumer spending. The Great Society was about ending poverty altogether. And they did this through a number of programs. And again, this is where it's so hard with students because there's so many possibilities, but I think these are the emblematic ones. Medicare and Medicaid, anti-poverty programs for healthcare, Head Start, educational investments into kindergarten to lower gaps in education, AFDP, an expansion of welfare programs to be provided beyond just widows but to single parents, and the Office of Economic Opportunity, which gave funds to local organizations in order to solve problems of poverty at the local level. The counterculture. So during the 1950s and 1960s, we would see now a rise under this liberal Keynesian government of a new radical culture that was taking place. And a good example of that in the 1950s was the Beat Poets. They criticized mass culture and the lack of experimentation. Betty Friedan, who was really in the mainstream, wrote The Feminine Mystique, criticizing the cult of domesticity, the notion that women should remain within the home and actually be fulfilled by remaining in the home. Betty Friedan by no means was a part of the counterculture, but Betty Friedan's ideas would eventually lead to a more radical third wave of feminism. Rachel Carson criticized the use of pesticides as a pollution that hurts ecological relationships. Again, Rachel Carson was by no means, she was a scientist, she was by no means part of the counterculture, but her criticism of the way the environment was being treated and the need for ecological relationships would eventually lead to a more radical side of the environmentalist movement. And Michael Harrington, who was a socialist, claimed that while most Americans are experiencing an increase in wealth, there is a huge degree of Americans who are experiencing poverty, which would lead to a strong criticism at that time of whether or not capitalism in America was really benefiting everyone. Ethnic movements. Martin Luther King seemed to lose control of the civil rights movement in 1964. During this time period, young black leaders, especially the most important example would be Stokely Carmichael, adopted Malcolm X's legacy of racial solidarity and black power and separatism. There was a similar pattern that we saw with other movements as well. For example, the Brown Berets, who were within the Chicano movement, adopted the idea of separatism to deal with issues of poverty and poor educational funding. AIM, the American Indian movement, took over Alcatraz Island at one point to protest the situation on reservations. And the third wave of feminism argued that men and women are different, but the feminine model is more appropriate. In other words, under this type of feminism, the argument was that men were driven by things like looking at the world through ambition, black and white lenses, and a competitive model, whereas women, who were different, looked at the world through nurturing, cooperative models of leadership in which community building was done. So according to this type of feminist model, the idea was to have a gender separatism. The Vietnam War protest. During the Vietnam War, radical college students at the beginning of the war established the Port Huron Statement, which was a statement by the radical left which argued that America's consumer society had led to inequalities and imperialism, in which, in order to deal with these inequalities, America had expanded out into areas like Vietnam. Seymour Hersh then revealed the cover-up of the massacre at My Lai. And in 1970, Kent State experienced the shootings leading to a question of U.S. policy towards college students. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were released, revealing that Lyndon Johnson had pretty much lied about the Gulf of Tonkin. It was true that there were 2 battleships that had been attacked, but those 2 battleships had been well within North Vietnamese waters, and on one of the occasions, one of the ships had not really been attacked, but had actually experienced a severe weather storm. Lyndon Johnson knew about this, but still told the public that they had been attacked. Nixon attempted to ease America out of the Vietnam conflict through what he was called the Vietnamization of the war, in which he would turn the conflict over to the Vietnamese. But the revelations of his bombings of neutral Laos created a credibility gap with the U.S. government and with the U.S. citizens. And this led up to what most historians believe is really the end of the 1960s, and that's 1973 with the Watergate Scandal. I like to point that out to students, that even though it's 1973, the point that historians bring out is that this really is the end of the themes of this decade. Nixon won the election of 1972 by a massive landslide, but afterwards it was discovered that there had been burglars in the Watergate Hotel, the place where the Democrats had held their major strategy sessions. 2 major reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, broke that story, and when they did, eventually the Congress called for tapes that had been used by Nixon in the Oval Office to tape himself. Turned out that as they listened to the tapes, Nixon had obstructed the investigation into the Watergate scandal. At that point, the Republican leadership asked Nixon to step down from his office in resignation. Historians really see this as the end of American idealism and a huge skepticism towards government. And what's interesting about this time that I like to point out to students is, what do we mean by that, about skepticism towards government? There have been a lot of people who have seen this as sort of like the growth and development of American liberalism and left-wing politics because Nixon was such a conservative. But there are actually a whole bunch of historians who believe that actually this was where conservatism took off, because in many ways Nixon was moderate in many of his policies, and the argument at the time really was that if Nixon, a conservative, would have had this much corruption within government, then you can't trust government at all. So the takeaways from a massive amount of information from two periods. First, the U.S. rose to leadership following World War II because of economic productivity and our monopoly over atomic bombs. The U.S. saw military containment and a global economic marketplace as the best strategies against communism. But eventually, internal disagreements over civil rights and Vietnam policy led to a credibility gap with government, in which the citizens and the government formed a deeper and deeper suspicion of one another. And as that happened more and more, we started to see a massive development of both new right politics as well as strong new left politics. So this is going to lead to a division that we still see being argued about today, the division between liberals and conservatives, or both the role of government and the cultural traditional versus modernist divide over how we ought to define our identity.